Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiumAtSpace22.com Podbean Podcast YouTube video. Today's interview is part of my ongoing series of what I call the Communio interviews. I am on the editorial board of Communio International Catholic Review, the North American edition, and they have asked me to sort of be their official podcaster. To that end, the new issue of Communio has arrived. It's the fall 2025. It's already February of 2026, but in good Communio fashion, they're behind. So they're not as behind as they used to be, but they're still behind. Fall 2025. And in this issue, there's a great article by my guest today, Dr. Jacob Sherman. So welcome to the show, Dr. Sherman.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, Larry. As I said at the beginning, I'm a long-time listener, but first-time caller. So
First time caller,
pleasure,
yeah. Who
pleasure to
started
be on
that
your
on
show.
who started that on call-in radio? Was that Rush Limbaugh, Larry King? I don't know, but it
I have
became
no
sort of
idea. Yeah.
standard, yeah. Long time listener, first time caller. That's good. I like that. Well, I'm glad you're a listener, so because that means you kind of know that the interviews tend to be sort of free-flowing, informal conversations more than me sort of interrogating the guest. But you are an interesting fellow. You got your PA. Where are you originally from, by the way?
My dad was a doc in the Army, so I kind of bounced around a fair amount in my childhood, and then my family settled in Colorado.
Oh, in Colorado. I grew up in Nebraska, so you were my next door neighbor. And
Yep.
got your PhD, Cambridge University, the Cambridge University in the UK. I love Cambridge. I've been to Oxford and Cambridge, more Oxford than Cambridge. Just I attended a lot of science and religion conferences at Oxford over the years. But Cambridge, I
Sure.
think, is a more beautiful campus, a more beautiful location. Oxford's gone all
Yeah.
commercial. But
Cambridge is gorgeous. It still has that sort of rural feel, cows wandering around in town. It's
sure
lovely.
does. Yeah, Cambridge is great. So, and you are currently a professor of philosophy and religion at the California Institute of Integral Studies. We won't go into any great depth into what that is. It's a school out in California is sort of a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach to things. A lot of graduate students, and you, as you said off camera, you're like the token Western Christian sort of professor there. So that's great. Glad to have you on the show today. But we are here to discuss your article in Communio entitled "The Authority and Eccentricity of Reason." I'll hold up the cover. There it is. There for those who are watching and not just listening. Yes, Communio International Catholic Review. Fall 2025, The Authority and Eccentricity of Reason. And the little tagline, which Communio always includes under its articles, which gives a sort of, I guess, nutshell condensation of what they think is most important, the editors. But the tagline says the intrinsic intelligibility of things involves a fundamentally ecstatic or eccentric conception of reason. And of course, you begin the article with a quote from Pope Benedict, sort of to that effect. So let's just you can launch into it in any way you choose. I don't want to dictate the conversation, but let's just
Sure.
begin with that. What do you mean by an eccentric conception of reason? By the way, to my listeners and viewers, I think this is an exceptionally good article. It's very important, as Benedict XVI pointed out, and you mentioned this in your article. What is at stake in this discussion, in this debate, is actually the survival of reason as such going into the future. So this is an extremely important topic. The nature of reason, what actually it is. The eccentricity of reason. What does that mean, and why is it important?
I mean, I think that the the fundamental idea is quite classical. It's not. I'm not proposing anything all that radical or novel. It's that reasons reason is fundamentally a. It's not necessarily calling it a faculty as in this sort of faculty psychology sense, but it's fundamentally a power that puts us in touch with the rest of the world in its own integrity and order and even otherness. It's part of part of the extraordinary capacity of beings like us that have reason is that we're not just self-enclosed and we don't just relate to the world through, say, appetition, consumption, etc. We also have the capacity to recognize the inherent order, otherness, and intelligibility of beings around us. And that's actually where I think where I think reason's primary activity lies, is its capacity to put us in this relational connection with others. And there's other things that reason does too, right? Reason has creative capacities, and um, it has uh, capacities for ordering our thinking and deductive, syllogistic reasoning, and all these sorts of things. But those more functional forms of reason have been taken, since modernity, really, we've tended to mistake those more functional, self-enclosed forms of reasoning for the primary activity of reason itself. And I think that's deeply misled us. As you say, it's led us to a conception that threatens, I think, the very nature of reason itself. I think the very understanding of what the human being is. If the human being is understood as the zoon, akon, logon, the the animal that has the logos or the animal that has some relationship to reason, when we get this deformed understanding of reason as fundamentally autonomous and self-enclosed, that builds for us a very uh, a parodic vision of the world and of our fundamental relationship to the world. I also think it has downstream effects that I didn't really get into in this article, an understanding of human beings as fundamentally individuals, autonomous, sort of these kind of like standard fictions of liberal political philosophy and things like that that go alongside of that. But I think a lot of it is just downstream of this really what curtailed understanding of what reason could be. The
Yeah.
Pope Benedict talked about the grandeur of reason and and restoring the grandeur of reason. I think that's the right way to think about this. That we've lost we've cut reason down to a very small and kind of hokey instrumental thing, and that is just fundamentally is a misapprehension of what it means to be human, and uh, and so much of our thinking is downstream of that move. I think it's also where a lot of the movements towards irrationalism come from as well. They're rejecting not a classical understanding of reason, but are rejecting this curtailed, essentially
Yes.
decapitated understanding of reason. So,
Yeah. Oh, wow. I mean, there's so much packed in there. Let's back up a sec. I mean, uh, we can go back to the classical world, say into a Platonic sort of mindset in which you find a sort of logocentric vision of our reason is participating in something bigger. I mean, you talk in here about the allegory of Plato's the famous
mhm,
the cave allegory, right? And that leads to a discussion, two Greek words, and you highlight them here that are so very, very important. Periagoge and metastrophe, which is sort of Plato says, periagoge, we need conversion, and metastrophe, we need revolution. We need a sort
mhm.
of radical, we need a radical revisioning of what our reason is. So one of to come out of the cave and to see but one of the things that always struck me in Plato's use of those terms and this term, and then we can get into this, is Plato is already in some sense, I think, right? He's already anticipating not critical theory as such, but the reduction of reason to simply the mundane, the practical, the
Yeah.
utilitarian, the here and now. And that's kind of what he's talking about. This is what we need to convert away from. So in
Yeah.
many ways, doesn't the Enlightenment was both very influenced, well, maybe the Renaissance is very influenced by Plato. By the time you get to the Enlightenment and Newton and modern mechanics, it just seems like Ian McGilchrist is right. I mean, you
Hmm.
find this complete destruction of the objective mind in favor of some kind of bizarre notion of utilitarian uses of reason.
Yeah. I mean, that's a perennial temptation, and I think you're right that Plato sees that instrumental use of reason as part of what he's warring against. Uh, I think the way that Plato sets this up, whether it's fair to the historical sophists or not, is Plato sets it up as this is the sophistic use of reason is uh, is the use of reason for whatever ends pre-exist your reasoning about the world, whatever
Yeah.
ends pre-exist. So it's a voluntaristic conception of reason. Reason is capable of determining the right path in order to get irrational ends that are somehow given to you either by the great beast of the crowd or by your, voluntaristic willing or in some sort of like Sartrean conception, right? Um, but
And that's far more irrationalist than a purely pragmatic utilitarian approach. It's deeper, cuts deeper.
Yeah, I think that's right. But if reason is incapable of having of participating in disclosing substantive ends to which we as human beings are ordered or to which other things are ordered, then that's really what you're left with. I mean, really that kind of absolute voluntarism. Iris Murdoch, I love Iris Murdoch, and she describes this in The Sovereignty of Good as Hampshire man, right? Pointing to these
Yeah,
early
yeah.
20th century British analytic ethicists the who perceived the essence of human activity as this kind of willing that is seeking to achieve its ends, but isn't capable of discerning perfections on their own. And so reason ends up being the tool that's used. It becomes subordinate to the voluntas, right? And I think that's what Plato was already arguing against. What uh, that's in many ways what I'm arguing against following them. Uh, but in the absence of a substantive conception of reason, that's all we're left with. I mean, in the absence of a substantive conception, Hampshire and Sartre and others are just drawing the conclusion, of what the world must be like. I think
Yeah.
Sartre's account is if there is no God, then there can't be natures because God can't have given natures to beings. And so all that's left is for us to will our natures into existence. And then reason is becomes the tool of that. So in one sense, the mistake, I guess, that Plato first diagnosed is the misordering of reason, that reason is uh, is made subordinate to appetite rather than the other way
Wow.
around, which is, I think, what Plato is trying to argue for.
Oh, that's fascinating. I think that's absolutely true. The reordering of the priorities here, where it's subordinated. It's subordinated, let's put it that way, to appetite. And that's clearly in my mind what Plato's after. But let's come back to the modern era. I mean, you mentioned in your article, of course, Charles Taylor, the immanent frame, and that
Sure.
none of us are these days all that ontically porous. We don't have ontically porous. I love Taylor's nomenclature. It's just great. Immanent frame, buffered selves,
Yeah.
ontic porosity, and so on. He's great. It's a great book. He spent a lifetime digesting it. But you mentioned Taylor, and of course, you mentioned Ian McGilchrist, William Desmond. You get into C.S. Lewis and the Abolition of Man, but then there's also a big section on the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, Adorno, and Ratzinger's sort of relationship with it, and this fascinates me. So I want to back up just a bit because
Please.
in order to set the stage for why your claim that we need to reclaim an eccentric, ecstatic view of reason as, in a sense, participatory in an objective realm that's relational and interconnected and all of these woo things, that we're flying in the face of the entire edifice of modern philosophy that is grounded in a sort of post-Enlightenment critical theory. I mean, the Enlightenment
Hmm.
goes through its period of like naive realism epistemologically, and everything's just billiard balls knocking together, and reason is about quantifying, but that doesn't last very long. Kant kind of sort of drives the death knell into that in some ways. But then, you see the rise of critical theory. So maybe for the listeners, the viewers, because I think this is very important because it leads to Horkheimer, it leads to modern philosophy. What is the essence of critical theory, and what is the challenge that it kind of poses to the notion of an objective rationality, an objective, as you put, a
Yeah.
substantive reason?
Well, I mean, as you said, the real watershed moment in this is the Kant's so-called Copernican turn, where
Yeah,
Kant seeks to lay out the conditions of possibility for any knowledge whatsoever. And the fundamental claim, without getting into the technicalities of it, that Kant makes is that the world as we perceive it, as we seem to immediately perceive it, is constructed or constituted by the operations of what Kant calls reason. And for Kant, reason is a constitutive and ordering faculty that generates the intelligibly sensible world as we experience it. So
yeah,
we think we're waking up into a world uh, that is out there and given to us, but before it is ever even capable of appearing to us, it's constituted by reasons, categories, and also by the forms of
yeah,
the intuition. But this this together produces the world that we seem to inhabit. And the key point that Kant is making, and what sort of sets him apart from, say, pre-modern thinkers who also knew, Aquinas knows, for example, that the thing is in the mind according to the mode of the knower.
quid
But
quid
for Kant,
recipitur, all that stuff.
yep, exactly. But for Kant, the point is that we can't know anything beyond our construction of it. So we're incapable of knowing what is constructed and what is given. He thinks there's a given world, right? There's a transcendental deduction and all this kind of stuff in which he tries to show that we have a right to think of the world this way and that this isn't just doesn't reduce to just an idealism. But we can't know anything about that. About the things in themselves, according to Kant. So, because all of our knowledge is downstream of this, sort of quasi-magical act of construction, if that's the case, then we don't have any real knowledge of the world outside of ourselves. We only have knowledge of the world as given to us, as constructed by us. So really, we only have knowledge of the world through ourselves. Now, that didn't last, as you said. Like there's in the same way that the kind of confidence in the Enlightenment billiard ball pattern gave way eventually. Likewise, the confidence in the necessity of the Kantian categories. Kant's absolutely certain that his categories are
Yeah,
absolutely necessary. Everything has to be apodictically given for him. Uh, that confidence in the necessity of the system is actually pretty easy to shatter. But what didn't get shattered was the sense of being kind of bereft in a world where we have somehow constructed it. It's just that instead of the rational construction of the categories in the Kantian system, now we think we're in a cultural or a linguistic cage that we can't get out of. And that leads to this sense that each culture or each language or even each person finally has a reality of their own. It's their world, their truth, etc. But you're not getting outside of it to a common world.
right,
Heraclitus says in that lovely bit where Heraclitus says, to those with logos, there's a common world, but those without the logos, are like asleep in their own individual worlds themselves. They're isolated into their own subjectivity and their own individuality. And I think that's in many ways the if you press things to their uh, theoretical conclusions, uh, the implicit metaphysics and the way we've thought about things leads to that kind of atomistic isolation. Happily, most of us don't end up following our explicit thinking all the way through, and I think that's one of the
yeah.
at the end of the article when I appeal to Plato. Part of the reason for doing that is not just because it's always good to go back to Plato, but also because Plato, I think, saw that the solution to this is that we're not just stuck in the mode of thinking or worldview, whatever you want to call it, that we inherit, but that there is the capacity of developing uh, the deeper powers of reason through education, through formation. And I think that that actually is like one of the most hopeful things you can say, that you might be born into this kind of benighted situation in which we exist with
Yeah.
a radical foreclosure of our capacities of thinking and reasoning, of perceiving even, but that we're capable of being transformed into something different, and
Well, that
that's
was the
chiefly
point. The
through education.
paideia, the pedagogy,
Exactly.
paideia is more than much more than simply the imparting of data bits and information. It
Yeah.
is the construction of an entire way of viewing things. But I want to go back to then, Kant could have an almost insouciant trust in the stability of his various categories, that he
Mhm.
thought the mind worked in these categories and they imposed them on reality. But Kant believed in God, right? And he had a kind of residual Christianness about him. And so he could
Kind of, yeah.
yeah, sort of, kind of, right, in that weird sort of Kantian way. And of course, he gets at God through morality and so on. Uh, Down with metaphysics and all that. But it always struck me that Kant still sort of presumes an orderly worldview. He's like a kind of pre-Nietzsche, pre-Darwin, so that
Yeah. Yeah.
later on we're going to get this deconstructive turn where you've got this generating mind that has these categories, but we need to deconstruct those categories into the muck of our reptilian brain and all that the whole thing.
Hmm.
The deconstruction, which then exposes in critical theory, all reason is veiled lusting after power and so on and so forth. Uh, and so you get the masters of suspicion, classic Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, all these guys. But then, okay, and so that's all very nihilistic. And that kind of leaves, but the Frankfurt School comes along, Horkheimer, Adorno, and those guys, and they're offering something a little different. It always seemed to me. Now I'm going to be the first. I don't really.
Yeah.
I've read one book by Horkheimer. Can't remember that you mentioned it. It's actually mentioned in your article. I can't remember the name of it now. Uh, but I've never quite completely understood his project. And you make the point in here that Ratzinger was kind of in dialogue with Horkheimer and then later with Gadamer. I mean, not Gadamer, Habermas. Uh, uh, so maybe unpack a little bit the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, that whole critical school, why it's
Yeah.
important.
Well, there are others who are far more expert on the Frankfurt School than I am, but my understanding of the way I'll just say how I relate to them in thinking about the history, the intellectual history of the 20th century, and also the cultural history, because they've had a huge impact on our culture. Um, they're coming from they're coming from left wing, sort of post Marxist understandings of the
Right.
world, and seeking to analyze especially the function of power and things like that. But with Horkheimer and Adorno, part of what's really interesting in them is in their efforts to understand the way in which the modern world was constituted as it is, how its ideological formation took shape. They recognize that they recognize the collapse of substantive reason uh, into functional or subjective reason, that from the objective
Yeah.
reason that can perceive is thought to perceive the integrity of things and the shape, the form of things, etc., into this subjective reason. They recognize the way in which that becomes essentially, sort of in their view, weaponized for the production of power and the dispossession of peoples and things like that. And that's what's so interesting about them is they diagnose the way in which this collapse of reason into pure functionality serves to dispossess people of their integrity, their dignity, and to support all of these movements towards totalitarianism and things like that. But what they don't have, and I think this is kind of where they find where they run into trouble, is they don't have any way of getting out of that. So their project becomes fundamentally one that I think is actually it can only be felt as parasitic. Or, it can only be felt as emancipatory as long as it's still parasitic on more robust
Yeah.
visions of the good that existed, right? You can deconstruct and critique these formations of power as long as there are still functional institutions that are grounded in a more robust vision of things. And it can be felt as emancipatory when you're doing so because everything turns wrong, at some point. So it's felt as emancipatory, but there's no way to build on it. There's no positive vision. They can't find their way through to, Adorno and Horkheimer both look towards the aesthetic realm for it. But even what they do with aesthetics isn't capable of producing a new vision of the real beyond themselves. And then I think Habermas tries to do it in looking at some sort of kind of merger of critical theory with pragmatism through speech acts and to look at the way that our communicative rationality allows us to articulate kind of procedural ways of belonging together. But Habermas himself comes to recognize that this doesn't have, to speak really colloquially, this doesn't have the juice to hold the people together. This doesn't have the thumos that is part of human experience and part of human belonging with one another. Or as Lewis says, the chest. As I see you pounding your chest,
It's
it's Lewis's
pounding my
chest
chest. I
that's
mean,
missing.
I always told my students that's what Lewis is talking about, men without chests. He's talking about
Yeah,
the thumos. He's absolutely talking about the
yeah,
thumos. I was thrilled when I read
yeah.
that
And
you
so,
were quoting the abolition of man. But anyway, I interrupted. Go ahead.
well, I mean, that's why it struck me. I mean, uh, Horkheimer gets in there for a couple of reasons. One is because he wrote a book called The Eclipse of Reason, so it's
That's
a
the
I think a
book.
really
That's the book I read, The Eclipse of Reason.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
And
Yes.
the eclipse of reason is a really interesting diagnosis of, and in a sense, a sort of a heavy-handed genealogy of how we get uh, to just finding ourselves thinking about reason merely as this subjective, instrumental faculty. And he writes it around the same time that Lewis is writing The Abolition of Man. Both of them are looking at their situation, looking at the kind of World War II period and the collapse of confidence in the European project, and in a sense, the collapse of confidence in modernity and downstream of Christendom and all these sorts of things. And they're both looking at it and saying something's gone wrong with the way that we understand reason and we understand the human being's integral relationship to a world that was previously thought to be intelligible in itself and now seems inaccessible to us. Uh, and they have these very, very similar ways of seeing the effects of that collapse of reason. That finally it will end up not just, as Lewis says, once you've turned everything into mere nature, you're also going to turn the human being into mere nature. So that in thinking that you're becoming masters and possessors of the world of nature, which is the word Lewis says moderns use to describe that which they can control, you end up naturalizing the human being and making him or her an object of control as well. And Horkheimer sees that same thing. The difference is that Lewis thinks we're not stuck in this vision of reason, that it's an aberrant vision of reason. And Horkheimer ends actually very, very sort of, um, it's a very kind of tragic ending in that he's looking
Exactly.
at this and
That's the
saying,
word I was
where
going to
can we
say.
go?
Tragic. It's
Yeah,
tragic. We need to go back, but we can't.
yeah, exactly. The doors are barred. In the way I put it in the article at one point is uh, essentially Horkheimer describes our descent into the cave. Rather than coming out of the cave, it's a descent into the cave, and now we're stuck in a kind of subterranean existence. And they just doesn't see a way for us to get out of that.
No,
Where, as Lewis, Ratzinger, others I think, have a different hope.
Well, I love too, you point out in there, and this goes back to the parasitic thing you were talking about before, and I want to come back to that because I think that's very important. But Lewis says, and you quote that, you just, in critical theory, you're constantly seeing through things.
Yeah,
I see through, I see what that really is, and then I see what that really is and what that really is until you're getting to the fact that nothing matters, nothing is real. And Lewis says you can't just keep seeing through everything, and eventually, when you see through everything, you're not seeing at all anymore. You're
that's
blind.
right. That's right.
Yeah, and so, but to go back to Horkheimer's thing about, and that's related kind of to Horkheimer's thing about, well, we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, the genie back in the bottle, whatever metaphor you want to use. There's an implication there, it seems to me, in Horkheimer and in all critical theory that a certain dragon has been slayed and the dragon is dead. That modernity and critical theory have destroyed the notion of whatever you want to call it, the good, transcendence, God, uh, some sort of objective realm that transcends the human, that is logocentric, in which we swim and participate, of which our reason is a sort of
Yeah.
a sort of offshoot of. And so Horkheimer is saying, no, the critical theory, modernity has killed that notion once and for all. So no matter how nostalgic we might be for it, no matter the nihilistic implications of what we're saying, we have got to come up with a model for human civilization that is still civilized but doesn't rely on these older constructions. And I guess I don't understand that level, that depth of pessimism. And before you answer, I mean, you imply in your article that maybe Horkheimer just had in view, when he was thinking of this more religious view of life, maybe he had in view the kind of sclerotic scholasticism of his time. Maybe he
Mm.
was maybe he was overly wedded to the notion that the retrieval of a more spiritual sense of reason, relational, eccentric, is tied with these moribund kind of theologies. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I say that because when he's talking, there's some parts in the Eclipse of Reason where he's clearly looking at certain Thomists and saying like that way's closed, we can't go there. But he's not, for example, citing von Balthasar or something like that. He's got a different understanding of uh, what a retrieval of pre-modern reason would look like, and I don't know how to account for that. I mean, I'm not enough of a sort of mid 20th century uh, Germanic scholar to know what Horkheimer's milieu felt like. It just
Yeah.
seems to me that he has a curtailed understanding of what's really possible out there. And I think I think there are two reasons to just think that this is a this is not just an untenable view on his part, but that it's actually a kind of cheap one. And that's because one, if we pay attention to our experience of navigating and negotiating the world, I don't think we fundamentally wake up in it in this kind of atomized isolation, and then we're managing the world through procedural reason alone as we come to make sense of it. Like my experience in life, my experience with my children is that they wake up in a world that's fundamentally relational, and we begin to come to ourselves through experiences of shared intentionality. Like I have my daughter's now 15, but when she was born, I remember those early years so vividly, and I remember,
Yeah.
experiencing the joy and seeing it on her face when we were both looking at the same thing, right? When we're both looking at, there was one night when I went out in Cambridge where she was born, and I had her strapped to my chest, and we went out and there was a full moon, and her eyes were drawn right to the moon, and I was looking at the
Yes.
moon and she was looking at the moon, and there's a sense that we're both looking at the same thing outside of ourselves and we're sharing in that. And that's this sort of fundamental moment of reciprocity and relationality and finally love. And and she starts to come to a knowledge of who she is through that. She comes to a knowledge of who I am. We're building that's far more basic than I'm now using my ratiocinative faculty in order to deduce this what this thing is and then putting it into a
Yeah.
linguistic
Oh,
package
yeah.
to right. That shared intentionality is so basic, and that's only possible if there is actual form in the world or patterns of
Yes. Some of
intelligibility,
the,
whatever you want to call it, if
oh, yeah.
form.
Some of the Latin church fathers referred to that. I mentioned in a previous podcast, they refer to it as a condilectus, an object of common
Yeah.
desire, an object of common love, a common devotion. Nothing, in a sense, drags out the relational aspects of our reason one with the other than a shared love of something outside of
Yes, exactly.
ourselves. I think you're so correct. I mean, did Horkheimer really live his life in this atomized, individualistic way that would deny the importance of these relational aspects? I doubt it. But the reason why I fixate on Horkheimer isn't because I think, Horkheimer is the greatest thinker of all times. But I do believe that there's, if I mean, you're involved in the academic world, I was involved in the academic world. There remains in the academic world
Mhm.
um, this strong this strong, almost hegemonic, almost dogmatic in its oppressive sort of system that says we cannot go back to the older constructions. And
Right,
no, and nobody's actually adding. I don't know of any intellectuals simply say, "Well, let's roll the clock back and let's just forget everything that happened post 1200 or something, post 1300." No one's saying
right,
that. But we are asking, as McGilchrist is asking, even someone like Paul Kingsnorth is asking, right? Are Can't we recover some of this stuff? And it seems like
right.
modern academia is yet no. And I think that it's tied to their political. So it goes back to Plato. They have an antecedent.
Hmm.
They are a conclusion in search of an argument. They have a set of political commitments to which they are devoted, and they believe that a return to a more noetic understanding of reason as objective and participatory and something bigger is a return to categories of identity and living that are constricting on freedom. I think that's a huge
Mm.
part of this. Anyway, I'm saying a lot. I don't know if you're getting the gist of what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to avoid
Yeah, no, I
using the
think
word woke and all that shit.
sure.
It's so overused. But anyway, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I hear you saying, and I agree entirely with this, is that uh the the sense that the door has been barred or that there's some sort of ratchet mechanism that prevents us from returning to any of the sense of the ontic logos in the world or something like that. Charles Taylor even says this at some point. I love
Yeah,
Charles Taylor.
he does.
I teach him regularly, but he'll say at times there's no question of returning to a time in which the ontic logos was accepted. I
Yeah.
just think this is not the case. It's only the case if you have um, a sort of artificially reified understanding of what we mean by form. Uh, I think it may be the case that we don't want to return to the kind of essentialisms associated with Christian Wolff or something like that in early modernity. Yes, nobody really wants to do that. But if the word form makes people skittish, let's talk about integral patterns of intelligibility that belong to things by nature. Whatever you like, there the
Yeah.
world is constructed in intelligible ways. And we come to recognize this intelligibility. This is part of what makes us the kind of creatures that we are. I'd argue, actually, even our capacity to use language is downstream of our ability to inhabit and, as it were, read a world of intelligible form. That
Yeah.
language is is derivative of that finally. But we don't have to think about form and our access to form in these kind of cookie cutter ways that we did in the past. We can recover a sense of form and recover a sense of it more dynamic, more morphological, more that requires a that's susceptible to different types of formation on the part of the persons, and so they come to perceive different forms based on their formation and enculturation and things like that. We can have all of that while still recognizing that the world is shot through with an intelligibility that we didn't inject there on our own. Uh, I and I think the only reason to deny that really is for extra theoretical reasons that don't come from our experience or from our thinking about the world, but that come from prior commitments, right? It can't be the case that the world has intelligibility, because where would that intelligibility have come from? If we know there is no God, then the world can't have intelligible form, because how could it
Right.
have intelligible form if there was no divinity behind it? I mean, that sort of argumentation, someone like Sartre makes it explicit and says the
Yeah.
quiet part out loud. But I think that lies behind a lot of this sense that it's not possible to think form any longer. Uh,
It's true.
I'm
And there, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think, for example, I think one of the most interesting ways to rethink form in modernity that remains deeply underdeveloped, but that is extraordinarily promising, is along the lines that Goethe started to pioneer in his relationship with nature, and not just with nature, also with cultural forms and things like that, and color, uh, but a Goethean approach to morphology, to form, recognizing that it's it demands a lot of us to perceive form in its integrity, to not just see what we already expect to find, but to be open to the development of form outside of our projections. That asks a lot of us. That requires not just cognitive work on the top 3 inches of your skull, but also uh, a somatic comportment to the world. It involves our sort of nature as embodied beings,
Yeah.
and all of that. And that isn't a throwback, right? I think it develops lines of thought that are already in Aristotle and the De Anima and already in Aquinas, but it develops them in novel ways. It's an alternative sort of modern conception of form rather than just an anachronistic attempt to rerun, say, the scripts of the 13th century or something like that. Um, but
Yeah.
that doesn't, that's not something that's on the horizon of Horkheimer
No,
and
and the thing
those
is, if you
folks.
read Balthazar and some of these, I mean, there's a way of construing form that involves the way of immanence.
Yeah,
That's terribly important. That one can that the splendor of being that shines forth in both. You can go to a simple atom, and it has a splendor kind of all its own, if you will. It shines forth, but it's of a very low type because its immanence is not of a high caliber, let's put it that way. But as
hmm
you ascend the scale of being, you get to human beings, angelic beings, then you see that the form is precisely characterized by a radiance, a splendor that comes from an inward immanence that is self-integrating and then shines forth, which is why then Balthasar can ultimately posit, right, that the ultimate ur form is Christ on the cross, this ugly,
mm,
kenotic descent into this ugliness of death by crucifixion, because it represents the kind of pinnacle of a kind of immanence. Why it's so terribly important to say that Christ, in a sense, owned his own death. That it's not something that just happened to him; it's something that he
right.
owned. All right, because it involves him. Anyway, I'm expositing here. I should be letting you talk, but
No,
I
no, it's
just
great. I love it.
no, I just think that the recovery of form is not what people think that it is,
Right.
and that there is a way. And that's I try to say this to my traditionalist friends too, who hate Balthasar because he thinks there's not enough people in hell or something. That. They just want to return to a straight Aristotelian Aristotle's got a lot going for him, and if we could recover Aristotle, that'd be great. If we even got that far, but there's more to the concept of form than simply the old Aristotelian categories. That's my point.
Yeah. Well, and I even think there's more to the Aristotelian concept of form uh, than the way we understood the old Aristotelian categories.
Yes,
So
yes.
there's a lot of, one of my mentors, my one of my doctoral supervisors, Catherine Pickstock,
Oh,
she talks
Pickstock. Oh,
about
I
the
didn't know
recovery
you.
of form.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good.
Well, she talks about the recovery of form in terms of what she calls antique naturalism, the need to go back to antique naturalism. And I like that language for it because it sort of it makes it it turns the recovery of form into something that makes it appear a little bit strange to our eyes. We think of form oftentimes in modernity as this sort of thing imposed from outside, rather than recognizing that uh, patterns of intelligibility within things is the way of understanding the world naturally, is the way of understanding the world, as you were pointing out, immanently. It opens beyond itself. Form can we can do a reading of form that opens beyond immanent closure.
Yes.
But it is actually a deeper naturalism than to think that things are, some sort of combinatorial story built up out of their constituent tiny little
Exactly.
parts.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to disparage Aristotle at all. I'm disparaging a certain construal of Aristotle as
I know,
just
yeah.
this static categories and so forth, and that's simply not true. I mean, that's why I said I'd be happy with a recovery even of Aristotle and Thomistic categories because they've been woefully misunderstood. But um, oh, I lost my train of anyway. I want to come back to this notion then of what time is it? Okay, we got time. This parasitic quality. I want to return to, in a sense, what's at stake here and why the ecstatic, eccentric view of reason is that which is most itself when it goes out of itself, is most
Hmm.
itself, most rational, most reasonable when it completes itself in contemplation, in what Plato called theoria,
Hmm.
that it's not simply calculation, that ultimately it's understanding, Verstand, it's
Yeah.
contemplation. But it seems like critical theory can't tolerate that because there always has to have some sort of foil against which they're fighting. Uh, which it strikes me. I mean, I'm not in any way a right wing conservative political guy. So, I'm not a Trumper and all that kind of stuff. So I want to preface my words by saying that. But it does seem to me that one of the things that animates so much of modern American politics on the left is the constant need to be constantly kicking open new envelopes, right? The
Yeah.
constant
Yeah.
the constant pushing open of more and more doors. Well, now we need to kick down this door. Now we need to kick down this door and this door and this door. And it seems like there's no endpoint. There's no logic, and it accounts for a certain level of the moral outrage. You have to be
Hmm.
outraged in order to kick open those doors. And so that's the stock in
Hmm.
trade motif of, all right, nobody's illegal on stolen land, as Billie Eilish said at the Grammys the other night. And she might be right. I don't know. I like Billie Eilish, but uh, you know, I wonder if her big mansion, is on stolen land. I don't know, but you get my point. There's this sort of constant
Yeah.
attacking of the man, down with the man. That is, it's kind of
Yes.
tiresome and old.
Yeah. No, I mean, gosh, how do I want to say this? Uh, I think, I think the politics of transgression could be felt as emancipatory as long as there was still a large functional culture that was otherwise impervious
Yeah,
to it, right? So, like, I think, uh, for Horkheimer is maybe a little bit different. I give people who went through World War II in Europe a big a big pass.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
there's a lot of reasons to be pessimistic coming out of that and so forth, but there is downstream of the Frankfurt School and also people like Gilles Deleuze and this kind of a world of broadly postmodern theories and things like that 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 is always in the mode of critique, always in the mode of unraveling, and that's only possible if I think that is only it's only possible to feel that as liberating so long as there's large structure that seems to maintain itself through that. I think we're not in that moment anymore. I think that the
Yeah.
politics of transgression that are still animating people in some ways, maybe just as a kind of habit. Uh, I think it's missing the moment that we're in because we're in a moment of such fragility, of such crisis of legitimacy in so many of our institutions,
Yes.
that just just running this kind of transgression as progress no longer works. We have to be rebuilding. We have to be refounding. We have to, there's some of the other articles in this issue. Um, I'm thinking in particular of DC Schindler's article, but also um, uh, Andrew Willard Jones's essay. They're both
The
pointing to
form
the
of the form Willard Jones, the form of power. Andrew, if you're listening, I'm supposed to interview him for this series too, but he's
great.
busy at the moment. Maybe in a few
I'm
months, so hopefully, yeah.
Well, they're both pointing to the the roots of authority in founding, right? That the Roman understanding of authority relates to the capacity to found new orders, new institutions that then exist and maintain their order. They maintain the form of life that we share and make, as Jones points out, make friendship possible. Uh, DC Schindler is pointing to a lot of this as well, and I think that sense that sense of the need uh, for foundations, that sense of the need, as Simone Weil puts it, the need for roots, is
I love her.
deeply in, is deeply in us, and is I think maybe even more acute now than when Simone Weil was writing, when Horkheimer was writing, even though they'd witnessed the great destruction brought about as part of World War II. We're witnessing maybe an even greater crisis of legitimacy as the post-war order comes to an end, and who knows what rough beach is slouching towards Bethlehem now.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. And that's it, boy, our two minds are moving in the same current here because the thing that struck me about your article, and it's is that it is so important because it's about more than just an academic discourse about the eccentricity of reason, different notions of reason. It leads directly to the crisis of our age, which I saw the biologist Brett Weinstein, who I don't always agree with. He was on a podcast the other day. He was talking about the biggest crisis that we face today is the crisis of institutional erosion. That
Mm,
there are no longer any institutions in our society that the people trust, that we can look to and say those institutions have authority, auctoritas, that they are generative. I mean, the word, I mean, as you point out there,
yeah, yeah,
the word authority comes from the same word as author, and it comes, the root words mean that which is very generative and
yep.
constructive. So true authority constructs a kind of moral authority, a moral vision for the people. And we don't have institutions that do that anymore. I mean, this is the great sad fact of the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, as
Hmm.
well as other crises in the Catholic Church. Gen Z, Gen X, millennials, whatever you want to call them, even now aging boomers, are all looking at these institutions. I saw an interview with Ross Douthat of the New York Times, who was saying that he has lost some of his enthusiasm for the church of late.
Mm,
And that's interesting. Uh, so there is, so it seems like, and you alluded to it, and I'm going to let you talk here in a second, is that can we revivify the old institutions, uh, even if it means a radical revisioning of those institutions from the sort
yeah,
of bottom up, or do we have to, as a friend of mine says, burn it all down and start again?
yeah. I mean, it's some of them we we have to expect will be revivified. I mean, I think the church is one of those,
Yeah,
since
yeah.
we have it on Christ's promise.
Obviously, right? Yes, that'd be
Yeah.
one. I don't want to
Um,
burn that down.
uh, but some other really big ones, I think, are I think the jury's out. I think about this in relationship to universities a lot, and in part because I just wonder if the transformation of the university from, say, 1800 and the birth of, the modern German research university, and until now, in whatever form it's taken, the kind of neoliberal universities that we're familiar with. Uh, I I'm I'm unsure whether that will be the mode of education that dominates the future. I hope it could be recovered. I love the university, deep affection for some of these
Yeah.
places, and love them like a almost like a family member. But but I also think that we've so separated our education, so fragmented it that it's hard for me to see these institutions rising to the moment of what I think's needed. So, for example, to put it a little more concretely, what I have in mind is not just the legitimacy crisis affecting them and the affordability crisis and all this stuff. This is all real, and is a big
Yeah.
issue for us here in the United States. But I think as we look at some of these new technologies that are being rolled out, the way that the world is transforming beneath our feet and will be different for, my children and their children in ways that we can hardly imagine. I think maybe the biggest task ahead of us is helping to design institutions capable of forming and teaching human beings so that they're able to live alongside these new technologies without losing their humanity. And that's a very
Yeah.
different task than our schools and our universities are ordered to right now. I think maybe we need something more like cathedral schools or something like, the even like a different form of monasticism that's fit for education, that something that addresses the whole of the human being as part of their education seems to me to be really important and not actually, I don't know that it's capable of emerging inside the institutions we currently have. So there are things like that that might have to be, if not burnt down, alternatives uh, might have to arise, and that
Yeah.
may happen in conjunction with some of their destruction. I get
Yeah.
skittish about some of the ways in which universities are being uh, targeted and put under duress right now. But even while I understand some of those complaints, um, but I'm also trying to pay attention for the places in which cracks open up and something new could emerge. I'm sure you know as much as I do how much university life is directed towards compliance with accreditation requirements, and there's so many
It's why I
bureaucratic
quit.
aspects.
It's why I
Yeah,
quit.
I
It's
get
why
it.
I left in
It's,
2013. Full professor, tenure, the whole bit, and I just walked away from it because I got tired. Our accrediting agency at our university was Middle States, and the constant drip, 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 incessant dictatorial emphasis on assessment, 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 assessment was
Mhm.
destroying the liberal arts. Fine. Assessment's fine if you're talking about nursing students, PA students, engineering students, the disciplines that have sort of database quantifiable sorts of mathematical pointed sorts of things you can, okay. But the liberal arts, how,
Right.
let's put it this way. I once taught a student, I won't mention his or her name, as dumb as a two by four. I mean, just stupid. And but very, very, very decent human being, and graduated it with a theology degree with a bunch of Mercy D's and Mercy C minuses. And I mean, after all,
Hmm.
where I was, DeSales University wasn't Harvard in the Poconos. Okay, so we had students like that. All right, and then one day I was at church. And this person was lecturing. It's a she. Okay, it's a female. One of this, and she was lecturing, and she got up from the pew with her five kids and her husband. And there she was, and she lectured beautifully, and she went and sat down. And I thought to myself, assess that, you assholes. All right. Uh,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, that's a success story. That's actually a
Yeah.
success story. And that's paideia. That's the
Right.
pedagogy of a certain community of discourse of which that we formed in the theology department at my university. And that's why it wasn't simply mercy deeds, as I called it. It was a sense of we're dealing with a real human being that we care about, and whatever knowledge we can impart to her, God bless her and get her on in life. And that's to me why, yeah, I look at the modern university with this obsession with assessment, with this obsession
Hmm.
with outcomes, which is all
Yeah.
part of the sort of quantifiable form of instrumental reason. And I despair of it. I did despair of
Hmm.
it. And I'm of two minds whether or not it just needs to be burned down and rebuilt with something else, or if it can be recovered. But I think the revision of it is already starting thanks to online things. And yeah, anyway, I'm rambling and getting all
Yeah.
weepy and autobiographical.
No,
But you get,
I agree. I agree with so much of what you've just said. I think we have very similar visions of what could be and unfortunately of what too often is. The I mean, one of the ways that your story is really beautiful, and one of the things that it reminds me of is that at least within the liberal arts, real learning should be rooted, as finally, all human culture is, in friendship. And that that connection of persons to other persons is the basis of our capacity to read together and the basis of our capacity to learn and grow. And there's natural hierarchies of teacher and student and things like that, and there's differences obviously, but there's if so often so often what instrumental reason does when it interjects itself. And I'm glad you brought back the language of instrumental reason here, because that is what this kind of assessment bureaucratic culture is inside our institutions. It it in, it inserts itself between persons and makes that primacy of friendship impossible. Uh, and that I think is, or makes it very hard. It frustrates the creation of friendship and learning, which should be there. It should be the most enjoyable thing. I remember I haven't gotten to teach Dante all that often, but I did. I remember doing a course just on the Divine Comedy, a summer course where we were reading Dante together over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, and we were meeting for 6.5 hours a day, just immersed in Dante. It was beautiful, and it's we grew very close to each other in that setting because we were engaged together in something of beauty, and we were looking at that together, and that is actually the natural birthplace for friendship, and friendship is the the space within which our capacity to perceive beauty is also possible, and to recognize it in one another and to recognize the other recognizing it, and that deepens our experience of it. Um, so to the extent that our institutions disallow that or make it extraordinarily hard, then we need something else to do it. And it doesn't have to be, I don't know what it is. I would love to see it. I would love to see
yeah.
uh, a revival of a richer kind of learning, because I so many of my friendships are friendships over these sorts of things, over
Yes.
the ability to see beauty together, and we learn so much from one another uh that way. I think that's uh
Yeah, that's
yeah.
why I do still believe in some sense, and am opposed to everything virtual, everything digital. There is there is no substitute for a brick and mortar community of people in a physical space
Yeah.
coming
Yeah.
together over 3 years, 4 years, whatever it is, shared living experiences, shared meals, shared conversation after class. I saw yesterday, for example, was for the feast of it was for the feast of the presentation and the candle ceremony at Notre Dame in Indiana. And of course, there's lots of controversy that swirls around Notre Dame's Catholic identity and all that kind of. I don't want to get into that. My wife's a Notre Dame grad, and I have a nephew who graduated there last year. And the thing is, there is still a strong Catholic culture amongst the students there. 2,000 students, 2,000
Mm.
undergraduates showed up for this, mass of the presentation and the festivities and ceremony afterwards. My wife's a domer and she still loves her time there. And I just think, and I love my college years, University of Nebraska and stuff. There's no substitute for the friendships, the communio, the
Yeah.
interrelation, and the mentors, the professor mentors that you develop lifelong friendships with.
Mhm.
in those anyway. Once again, I'm
It
pontificating.
it's also I think it's also the space within which uh in my experience at least, I don't want to universalize this for everybody, but in my experience, thinking alongside your friends and mentors, as well as, some of your enemies, I guess, but thinking
Yeah.
alongside your friends and mentors and others with whom you have a relationship with, it's so much richer and more creative than just trying to, survey the books and the online discussions and whatever, and like come to some sort of encyclopedic intervention into something. It's very different. There's a very different phenomenology to thinking with people whom you have a shared life, alongside people whom you share life, than just
Yes.
thinking
Yes.
abstractly. And
Yes.
so I think that's really important. And
Yeah.
it's hard to communicate that to to those who don't experience it, I think.
Yeah. It is possible somewhat in the digital world to do that. I have now, and you
Yeah.
probably do too. I have many friends that I have made
Hmm.
via social media. That I have a good dear friend, Cale Zeldin. I did a podcast with him yesterday. He teaches English at a prep school up in Rhode Island. We've never met in person. We're going to meet in person in March, but we've developed this really strong friendship just
Yeah.
over these sorts of interviews and so forth. It is so. It is. I
It is
mean,
possible.
it is
Yeah.
possible. It is possible. And that's the hope that as we try to resurrect some form of reason that isn't simply instrumentalist in this way, maybe we use the tools that are given to us. And I'm like I said before we went, I'm a Luddite and I hate all this digital stuff for the most
Yeah.
part. But, it's here.
I'm kind I'm kind of with you. I end up doing so much of my life is spent online. But but without the other side of it too, I would feel I would feel
Oh,
just
yeah.
deracinated.
I would
Yeah.
too. I mean, look behind you, look behind me. I mean, those things
Hmm.
there, I think there's no substitute for a tactile book. But
Hmm.
I don't think that makes me old fashioned. There's something to it. But anyway, I think we kind of have reached the end of the conversation here in some ways. Is there anything that you would like to add about your article or anything that we haven't covered?
No, just thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. I actually just really enjoyed hanging out and talking with you. This is
Yeah.
this is a lot of fun. So
If you're ever in
thank
Scranton,
you for the time.
if you're ever in Scranton, PA, come on by. We'd love to host you. Although
I might take
Scranton,
you up on that.
don't come now. It's bitter cold, and I hate winter.
I know. I'm seeing over here. It's beautiful. It's like 67 degrees
I
out.
don't want to
I
hear it.
might go swimming outdoors later on today.
Oh God, I hate winter. Winter is the Antichrist. But anyway, all right, everyone. Well, thank you, Dr. Sherman, for coming on the show today. Wonderful article. Everybody should fly out and get this issue of Communio on Authority just for this article. There's a lot of other wonderful articles in there as well. So thanks, Dr. Sherman, for coming on the show today.
Thank you,
And
Larry.
thanks everyone for listening. Bye now.